Do you remember your childhood fears? Those seemingly harmless things that, as a kid, were genuinely terrifying. Maybe it was bugs, dolls, or certain TV shows or music. For me, it's a bit funny to admit, but I was terrified of milk candies. Yes, those ordinary, edible milk candies. Just hearing about them would fill me with dread. This fear stems from a childhood memory, back when I was about 5 years old in kindergarten. Though the memory is hazy, I think I can still recall what happened. Back then, I had a stutter and struggled to speak clearly. Afraid of being laughed at, I barely talked, almost like I was mute. Fortunately, I had a friend who didn't mind my silence because she wasn't much of a talker either. She was a sweet little girl, very obedient to the teachers, quiet, and never cried, so she often received small snacks and milk candies as rewards. I think I liked her back then, enjoying her company, but my stutter made me too afraid to speak freely. So, I often followed her from a distance in kindergarten, watching her as I trailed behind. If something was in her way, I'd clear it. If she was about to fall, I'd rush to catch her. Every evening before dismissal, the teachers would sit in the hallway chatting, giving us an hour to play freely in kindergarten. This led to the peculiar sight of her walking ahead, and me quietly following behind. But then, one evening, something happened that I'll never forget. It was during the usual free playtime before dismissal. I had to use the restroom, and by the time I came out, everyone had already scattered across the playground. I struggled to spot the girl in the crowd but couldn't find her anywhere. Had she hidden herself? She'd never done that before. Maybe she'd brought some tasty treat and didn't want to share, so she'd sneaked off to eat it alone. That must be it. With that thought, I searched even harder, and finally found a secluded spot in a corner of the kindergarten, a narrow alley formed between a sealed-off single-story building and a wall. It was like a dead end, easy to miss unless you looked closely. She must be hiding there, I thought, and rushed in. Even now, recalling that moment fills me with fear. I still can't make sense of what I saw, and as time has passed, the memory has grown fuzzier. What I do remember is seeing her standing at the very end of the alley, next to a tree. I remember that tree. Everyone knew it, and we'd even given it a name, Ryan. The girl stood under Ryan, eating something. What was it? Ice cream? No, it didn't look like that. Cookies? Not that either. What was it? I froze, staring at her as she ate. Then, in an instant, I was overcome with an inexplicable terror and bolted out of the alley. That night, I came down with a high fever and didn't return to kindergarten for several days. When I finally recovered, I overheard my family talking about something. They warned me not to eat small things carelessly, especially tiny candies. They said the girl had stuffed too many milk candies into her mouth at once, accidentally choking on them and suffocating to death. The news shocked me, and the image of her eating something under the tree in the alley flooded my mind. It was such an ordinary scene, yet I couldn't understand why it had terrified me so much. That night, I had a nightmare. In the dream, I was back in the alley. The tree, Ryan, had grown enormous, its wrinkled bark forming a face that laughed menacingly. The entire tree twisted like a snake, and the girl stood beneath it, her face contorting in agony as if she were suffocating. Then, in an instant, countless milk candies burst from her mouth, and she died right in front of me. I woke up screaming. That nightmare left a deep psychological scar. I never returned to kindergarten after that, and I developed an intense fear of milk candies. Even now, as an adult with a job, the mere mention of milk candies fills me with unease. Recently, though, I met a woman who shares my values, and with whom I feel a strong connection. We've been considering taking our relationship further, but when I asked about her job, I learned she works for a candy company, specifically in the milk candy division. If we were to marry and build a life together, milk candies would inevitably become a part of my daily life. Not wanting to let this fear ruin our chance at happiness, I finally decided to confront my phobia and sought help from a psychologist. After explaining everything, the psychologist suggested that the traumatic news of the girl's death, combined with the distorted and increasingly vague memory of that day, had likely caused me to develop PTSD, with milk candies becoming the focal point of my fear. Following an evaluation, the psychologist proposed a treatment plan. I should revisit the kindergarten and the alley that haunted my nightmares. By confronting the source of my fear, I might gradually overcome it. I agreed to the plan, and a few days later, accompanied by the psychologist, I returned to the kindergarten. Little had changed there, and the elderly vice principal, who had been a teacher since his youth, greeted us. As he led us around, I felt a strange mix of familiarity and unease. Then, suddenly, my heart skipped a beat. I saw it. The alley. I gestured to the vice principal that I wanted to go there, but even with the psychologist supporting me, my heart raced as I approached the corner. By the time I stood at the entrance, I was gasping for breath. But when I finally looked inside, my fear dissipated. Unlike the dark, damp alley in my memory, it was now bright and cheerful, with cute graffiti on the walls and sunlight streaming in, and the tree that had once been called Ryan was gone. That's impossible, I insisted. I remember it clearly. There was a tree here, and the kids called it Ryan. At the mention of Ryan, The vice principal's expression changed. Ah, Ryan, I remember him. He was a male janitor here. The kids used to call him Ryan affectionately. Honestly, the teachers admired him back then. He had this trick where he could calm a crying child with just one milk candy. But over a decade ago, we found out he had a prior conviction for rape and had to let him go. A few years ago, he was arrested again for molesting a minor and sentenced to prison. The revelation left me stunned. The tree, Ryan, wasn't a tree at all, it was a person. And the memory of that day, the girl, the alley, and the milk candies, all took on a new, unsettling meaning.